I'm actually going to start with a story because that seems appropriate. I'm reading, this is a story somebody wrote to us. So this is in his words. I don't remember the exact year, but I do know that it was a stressful time for both of us. My wife and I were just starting to get our feet planted when she began to have pain and cramping more than usual during her period. So she finally went to the doctor and then to a specialist. That's when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Our journey had just begun. Caring for my wife was never difficult, but hiding my fear and emotions was. Watching Jeffrey's video on your Facebook page and hearing about his father being stoic made me feel better about being the same way. I was stoic because I felt I had to be. Showing my true feelings to my wife and kids was never an option. I felt like I had to be the rock for them to lean on. Because Daddy wasn't worried, they weren't either. But I was and still am. That was written to us in an email from someone called Jesus Gonzalez, who watched a video that we produced as part of our We Know You Care campaign. I mean, he saw his own isolation and inability to voice his emotions in the story of Jeffrey, who's a caregiver. I'll come back to the campaign in a bit, but what's important to note for now is that while most of us have a story, a moving and emotional story of when we cared for someone we love or someone cared for us, as a society, we actually think of these caregiving experiences as our personal, private, individual burdens to bear. And we don't really think of this as like an urgent social issue that needs a collective solution. So my role is actually to use storytelling to make people think of caregiving as a collective social issue. No big deal at all. So I work at Caring Across Generations, as Katie said. It's a national campaign made up of families, caregivers, domestic workers, people with disabilities, and aging Americans, all working to transform the infrastructure for care. And our goal is to both make sure that people can access the care they need throughout our lifetimes, but also so that people providing care, who are domestic workers and family caregivers, are supported and valued. So as a campaign, we're a pretty ambitious campaign in that we work through 3 integrated strategies. We do policy change work at the national and state level. We organize people online as well as across 13 states on the ground, and then we also shift norms and attitudes around caregiving, which is the work I do. And it's really important, I think, sort of to note strategically that the culture change strategy was built into the work of Caring Across from the beginning. Bridget actually helped draft it. So we can talk more about the strategic piece, but I just want to note that it is rare to have organizations that commit to culture change alongside doing policy change and grassroots activism like Color of Change does as well. So our culture change goals are up there. Clearly, these are very long-term goals and they're ambitious, but it's really about moving from care being seen as an invisible and undervalued aspect of our culture to being visible and valued, and really getting people to think of this as an urgent social issue that needs a collective solution rather than something I have to deal with on my own. We actually started off really focusing on millennials a lot and sort of intergenerational relationships, and then recently, over the last 2 years, we found that people who were closer to or perceived themselves as closer to our problem were better targets for us. So now we focus on sort of Gen Xers and baby boomers, which is still a huge, very wide bucket of work. So how do we create culture change? And I'm sort of repeating a lot of the tactics and strategy that Elizabeth shared earlier and Rashid shared. But at Caring Across, we work to create a 360-degree storytelling environment in which we elevate and make visible caregiving and caregivers. And caregivers are really at the kind of center of these stories. And when I say caregivers, I mean domestic workers as well as people who are caring for a family member. And we do this in 3 sort of ways that often kind of integrate. We seed and influence stories in TV and film, the way Color of Change and Define American do. And we primarily do that through a coalition that many of us are founding members of called Storyline Partners, which is a coalition of 13 organizations working in Hollywood. We also collaborate with storytellers and artists to create digital content. And then the third thing we do is that we produce digital campaigns that have content at the center that help us really engage with people online. So the first strategy really allows us to access scale, but the second and third are sort of the ways in which we can get intimate with people like Jesus and engage them. This year, we decided to go kind of deep in terms of interrogating a particular cultural barrier that we believe has stood in the way of valuing care, which is sexism. I don't know how many people in this room saw this film? Okay, pretty good. So we partner pretty closely with Participant Media. Participant Media produced this movie. It just came out in December. We created a social impact campaign around this film in partnership with Participant for a number of reasons. So Participant Media basically reached out, sent me a script and said, hey, this is a film about gender equality and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but it's also a film about caregiving. Do you want to take a look at the script? So for people who didn't see this film, it's basically set in RBG's early career in like 1970, where she took on a case and took it to the Supreme Court on behalf of a man who was the primary caregiver for his mother. His name was Charles Moritz. And he was trying to access a tax deduction that was only available to women because the law assumed that only women were caregivers. RBG took on this case because she wanted to set a precedent against gender discrimination in the law. And of course, she won the case. And for us, we were like, firstly, it's very rare to see caregiving show up in such a central and explicit way in a movie. But not only was it about caregiving, it was actually about benefits for family caregivers. And as you can imagine, that is not something that shows up on television and film very often. So after reading the script, we decided to leverage it to run a campaign specifically to engage men and male caregivers around our issue. Okay, so why would we want to engage men when care work, both in families, as family caregivers, as well as paid care work, has been done primarily by women and women of color for many years? Because today, actually, 40% of the 40 million people caring for a family member, an adult family member in this country, are men, which basically means 16 million family caregivers in this country are men. And studies show that caregiving men are extremely isolated. They don't identify as caregivers. They don't reach out for help or support, and they suffer from a lot more mental sort of problems and illness than the women in these roles. So interestingly, the same sort of traditional gender norms that have devalued care for so many years have made it so that the men who are now doing this work are silent members of the caring majority. The demographics have changed, but the culture hasn't caught up. So we wanted to engage these men, call them in, and help define a new kind of healthy masculinity, like rooted in care. So the campaign actually began in mid-December with a screening that we did of the film, which was followed by a panel discussion about masculinity and caregiving. The panel discussion was between Justin Baldoni, who's an actor on Jane the Virgin. He does a lot of thinking and talking about masculinity, and then we brought in a family caregiver who's a man, and we brought in a male care worker, and then Aijen Pua, co-director, moderated it. The reason for doing that screening in December was because we wanted to kind of jump in on the pre-release buzz of the movie, trying to get some media around the idea that masculinity is something that we need to unpack when it comes to caregiving. We then sort of worked with Participant Media to get clips from the film, as well as images from the film, and a lot of quotes around that deal with caregiving that actually talk about the care work that happens in the movie, as well as the way in which Ruth Bader Ginsburg fought her case to challenge these gendered attitudes. The second thing we did, and I don't have time to show the video. Should I show it? Oh, okay. So the second thing we did, which was, I think, the center for us of the campaign, was that we filmed videos of men talking about their caregiving experience, but they weren't just sharing their stories. We were asking them to share how they think their notions of their own manhood and masculinity shape their experiences. And most of these men had never thought about their own masculinity in like this explicit way before.
My name is Ivan Lambert.
Oh, could you turn it up?
I'm a caretaker for my wife, Marcia, who has MS. MS is a multiple sclerosis. It's a disease of the nervous system. When we got the diagnosis, she had an MRI, and it was confirmed that she had these white plaques in her central nervous system and in her brain as well. the transition was very difficult. At first, she was walking with a cane. It wasn't long after that, she started walking with a walker. But after a while, it became harder and harder to do those things. And she ended up in a wheelchair. She's been in a wheelchair now for about 15, 16 years. The hardest challenge I've had to face is giving up some of my independence and also to be more patient with the reality of the disease. You get angered because things don't happen the way they happened before. For example, she can't pull herself up from the toilet. I have to help her out. And at times she can't even move herself, so I really have to strain myself to help her. Occasionally I put my feet in the wrong direction. My wife runs over my foot with her wheelchair. That hurts. I blame myself more than her because she can't see necessarily what's in front of her or behind her for sure. Sometimes I do get very angry and emotional about that. Finally, I decided that I need to get some help. Went to some caregiving classes. I think you can learn how to be more patient, how to adjust your attitude, taking a deep breath, relaxing, making fun of things instead of taking them so serious. You have to remember it's a disease, not the person that you've married or you're living with. Men are more cautious or don't want to discuss the situation. I think women are much more open and much more sociable than men usually are. We don't want to look foolish or have people look at us in a funny way. My role is sort of reversed. We both worked. My wife would cook when she came home, make dinner, set the table. Sometimes I have two jobs, so I wouldn't get home till late, but dinner was always ready. I do most of the cooking now. In fact, I've learned I love baking. I do laundry at times, even though we have help. There are times when we run through a lot of clothing during the week because the wife soils herself. Women have always been thought as the person who does the caring in the family. The husband would work, the woman would take care of the kids, but I think that's changed a lot in today's world. I have met 2 or 3 other men through the caregiver classes I've taken. We all have difficulty handling those experiences and deflating the anger that we go through. So we share war stories, as I call them, with each other and try to resolve or help each other understand how to best handle the situations. I don't think I'm a nicer person, but I've learned to control my anger. The experience has helped me to go around those barriers, to go through the barriers, become a better person and become a better caregiver.
This campaign, there was 2 other videos like this, as well as other digital assets that shared stories from men in our network. And we really targeted the content directly at men, and men who were in caregiving roles but might not identify as caregivers. We did that through the media, like you'll see in this. Mandatory is a men's magazine, and I was just really excited that this title of this article was Badass Men, Redefining Masculinity, and Ivan Lambert, our caregiver, was like one of the badass men who was featured. But again, this is about putting the protagonist who might not normally be at the center of a story, to kind of flip that script and put them at the center. The digital campaign kind of ended with a Facebook Live that we did, which was the children. There were 3 children of dads who were all caregivers. So the dads were all caregivers, and the children were discussing how they thought their dad's sort of idea of masculinity and manhood shaped their caregiving, and how the children had to become caregivers for their dads, because the dads were not able to care for themselves. We partnered with Upworthy on this just to kind of reach a new audience, and we got a lot more men who engaged with our work than ever before. These are just some. So when we talk about caregiving and aging, most of our digital network is women. So this really got us more engagement from men than we've ever received before. As with Jesus, this strategy of leveraging pop culture products and connecting them to kind of real life experiences really seems to resonate with people when it comes to care, because what it does is it takes their individual experience and brings it into the open, and then brings it into kind of community with other people. And once they're engaged, we have the opportunity to show them how their personal private experience actually connects to a cultural, social, political context, and then we can kind of move forward from there. I don't need to tell this crowd that stories matter, that representation matters, that it matters to see one's experience reflected either on TV or on a Facebook feed. But the thing that happens when we replace existing stories with new ones, and existing protagonists with protagonists who aren't normally at the center of that story, is that we literally flip the script and we start shifting cultural power. And that is basically why we're here and what we're here to do and what I try to do in my work. The idea that we shift power from the status quo, but we also envision, and by envisioning, we actually can create a new cultural narrative. That's really the work that we're trying to do. Thank you.